For 3 years, my life had been a study in quiet observation. From the drafting table in the corner of the open-plan office, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of Julian Vance's glass-walled office. It was a fishbowl of my own making, a place where I could watch the steady, gravitational pull of the man who owned the firm and, inadvertently, a significant portion of my waking thoughts. Julian was a man carved from stillness and quiet confidence. He didn't command a room with volume. He commanded it with presence. When he spoke, his voice was a low current of granite and calm that made everyone else's frantic energy seem foolish. I had cataloged everything about him. The way he'd pinch the bridge of his nose when a contractor was being difficult, the almost imperceptible upward tick of his lips when a design was approved, the way he'd roll the sleeves of his crisp white shirts up his forearms, revealing a dusting of dark hair and the face of an expensive, practical watch. I was an architect, a good one, but at Vance and Sterling, I felt more like a ghost, haunting the periphery of my own career. My work was solid, my designs praised for their clean lines and sustainable ethos, but I was quiet, unassuming. I was Leo, the guy in the corner who did good work. That was the extent of my identity. This quiet, aching loneliness was a familiar coat I wore without thinking. My crush on Julian was a part of that coat, a secret pocket where I kept a foolish, impossible warmth. He was my boss. He was, as far as anyone knew, straight. And I was, me, a footnote in the story of his life. The catalyst arrived on a Tuesday, disguised as a manila folder. Julian's assistant, a woman with a perpetually frazzled energy that bounced off his calm like a moth off a window pane, placed it on my desk. "Mr. Vance wants to see you," she said, her words clipped. My stomach performed its usual pathetic flip-flop. A summons was rare. Usually, my interactions were limited to brief nods in the hallway or a concise, "Good work, Leo," on a memo. I walked toward his office, my shoes suddenly too loud on the polished concrete floor. He was standing, looking out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city below, a silhouette of tailored gray wool against the afternoon light. "Leo," he said, turning as I entered. He didn't smile, but his eyes, a deep and unreadable shade of hazel, met mine. "Close the door." My heart did a slow, painful lurch. I closed the door, the click of the latch sounding like a verdict. He gestured to the folder I was holding. "You've read the preliminary brief on the Hawthorne project?" "I have." I managed, my voice sounding thin. The Hawthorne project was the talk of the office. A reclusive tech billionaire wanted a completely self-sustaining, off-grid retreat built on a massive, untouched parcel of land in the most remote part of the state. It was an architect's dream. "Good," he said, moving to sit on the edge of his massive mahogany desk. The posture was casual, yet it radiated authority. "The client is particular. He wants a boots-on-the-ground survey, not just topographical data. He wants us to feel the land, to understand its contours and its character before we draw a single line. He wants us there for 3 days." I nodded, unsure where this was going. He was the principal. He could send any of the senior partners. "Your portfolio on the Aspen Ecolodge was the reason we got this meeting, Leo. Your understanding of passive heating and sustainable water sourcing is what he responded to." He specifically asked for the mind behind that project to be on site. He paused, his gaze steady. "I need you to come with me. We leave Thursday." The words hung in the air-conditioned silence of his office. Just us. For 3 days. Away from the city, away from the rigid hierarchy of the firm. A knot of terror and exhilarating hope tightened in my chest. It was a professional opportunity of a lifetime, but my traitorous mind immediately leaped to the personal implications. Hours in a car with him. Days on a mountain with him. It was a fantasy so potent it made me feel dizzy. "Of course, Mr. Vance," I said, the words feeling inadequate. "I'll be ready." He gave a single, decisive nod. "Good. Be at my place at 6 a.m. Thursday. I'll drive." And that was it. I was dismissed. I walked back to my desk in a daze, my hands trembling slightly. The fishbowl had shattered, and I was about to be pulled into the water with him. The drive north was a long, unfolding ribbon of silence. Julian's truck was an extension of himself, clean, powerful, and understated. The interior smelled of worn leather and a faint, clean scent that I recognized as his cologne, something crisp and woodsy that I'd only ever caught in brief whiffs in the office. Now, It filled the small cab, an intimate presence that made the space feel even smaller. For the first 2 hours, we barely spoke. He drove with an easy, focused competence, his large hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. I watched the landscape change from urban sprawl to rolling farmland, then to the dense, dark green of the encroaching forests. I spent the time pretending to look out the passenger window, but my attention was almost entirely on him. I watched the subtle shift of muscle in his forearm as he changed gears. I watched the way his jaw was set in concentration, a faint line of stubble shadowing its sharp angle. I studied the crinkles at the corners of his eyes, relics of smiles I had rarely seen directed at me. My mind was a relentless engine of analysis. Every small thing became a clue to be deciphered. He adjusted the climate control, and a stream of warm air ghosted over my side of the cab. He noticed I was cold. My inner monologue was both hopeful and mocking. "Or the truck has automatic sensors, you idiot." He passed me a bottle of water from the center console, his fingers brushing mine as I took it. A jolt, small but electric, shot up my arm. I saw his fingers tighten on the steering wheel for a fraction of a second. Or did I? Was I projecting my own desperate yearning onto every innocent gesture? This was the torture of it. The not knowing. The constant, looping question of what was real and what was just the fantasy I had constructed in my head. "Are you warm enough?" he asked suddenly, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the seat. I jumped slightly. "Yes. Fine. Thank you." He glanced at me, his expression unreadable in the shifting light filtering through the trees. "You're quiet." It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. "I'm thinking," I said, which was true. I was thinking about the impossible proximity of his shoulder to mine, about the faint, clean scent of his laundry detergent, about the way his presence filled up all the available space, leaving little room for my own breath. "About the project?" he asked. "Yes," I lied. "About the orientation of the structure, maximizing solar gain in the winter months." He nodded, accepting the answer. "That's what I was thinking about, too. The southern face of the ridge will be key." He launched into a brief, technical discussion of geological surveys and wind patterns. It was familiar territory, a safe harbor of professionalism in a sea of unspoken tension. I latched onto it, grateful for the anchor. We talked about work for the next hour, and it was almost normal. Almost. But underneath the talk of blueprints and building materials, the awareness of him, of his physical presence so close to mine, was a constant, humming current. We arrived in the small, forgotten town of Northwood as dusk was bleeding into the sky. It was little more than a single main street with a gas station, a diner, and a motel whose flickering neon sign advertised vacancy, and color TV, a heavy, wet snow had begun to fall, thick flakes melting on the windshield. The air was cold and smelled of pine and impending storm. "This is it," Julian said, pulling the truck into the motel parking lot. "The Summit View Inn. Only game in town." He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was profound. For a moment, we just sat there, the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers the only sound. "I'll check us in," he said finally, opening his door and stepping out into the flurry of snow. I watched him walk toward the small, brightly lit office, his broad shoulders squared against the weather. He was a figure of competence, a man who always seemed to be in control. I felt a familiar pang of admiration and something softer, something more vulnerable. I waited, the minutes stretching out. The snow was coming down harder now, blanketing the truck in a soft white coat. I was starting to get genuinely cold, the engine's residual warmth having long since faded. My anxiety began to prickle. What if there was a problem? What if there were no rooms? The thought of having to drive another hour in this weather to the next town was exhausting. Finally, his silhouette appeared again, moving back toward the truck. He opened the driver's side door, bringing a gust of cold air and the scent of wet wool with him. He didn't get in. He just stood there for a second, looking at me. His expression was strange, a mixture of something I couldn't quite place, annoyance, resignation, maybe something else. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single plastic keycard. He didn't hand it to me. He let it drop from his fingers into my open palm, where it landed with a soft, definitive click. His eyes held mine, and in the dim light of the dashboard, they were dark and intense. "Inside," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Just that one word. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. My heart hammered against my ribs. One key. He'd booked one room. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. A mistake. The motel was full. It was the only option. But the way he said it, the weight of his gaze, felt like something else entirely. It felt like a line had been crossed. He shut the door and walked around to the back of the truck to get our bags. I sat there, the cold plastic of the key card sweating in my palm, my mind a whirlwind of panic and a wild, terrifying hope. I got out of the truck, my legs feeling unsteady. Julian was already pulling our 2 duffel bags from the bed. He slung his over one shoulder and handed mine to me. He didn't say a word. He just started walking toward the numbered doors lining the covered walkway. I followed, my footsteps silent in the fresh snow. He stopped in front of room 7 and waited, looking at me expectantly. I fumbled with the key card, my fingers numb with cold and nerves. The light on the lock blinked green, and I pushed the door open, stepping into a wave of stale, overheated air. The room was small, painfully small. It was dominated by a single, massive king-sized bed with a questionable floral bedspread. There was a small table with 2 chairs crammed into one corner and a dresser with a bulky television on it. That was it. No couch, no cot, no other option. Just the bed. One bed. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a catastrophic, tension-filled disaster. Julian stepped in behind me, closing the door and shutting out the sound of the wind. The small room instantly shrank by half. His presence was overwhelming. He dropped his bag by the door and stood there, surveying the room with that same unreadable expression. "They messed up the reservation," he said, his voice flat. "This was the last room. The storm's closing the pass, so driving on isn't an option." He stated it all as fact, a report on a logistical problem. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the bed. It sat there in the middle of the room like a monument to our shared predicament. I felt a hot blush creep up my neck. I, a grown man, was about to have to negotiate sleeping arrangements with my boss. My boss, who I had spent years secretly fantasizing about. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. "I can take the floor," I said quickly, my voice coming out too high. "I don't mind. I can use the blankets." "Don't be ridiculous, Leo," he cut me off, his tone sharp but not unkind. "The floor is filthy, and you'll freeze. It's a big bed. We're both adults." Both adults. The phrase sounded absurd. I felt like a teenager, flushed and awkward and completely out of my depth. He moved past me, his arm brushing mine, and the contact was like a brand. He went into the small bathroom and turned on the shower. The sound of running water filled the silence, but it did nothing to ease the tension coiling in my stomach. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, my duffel bag still clutched in my hand. This was happening. I was going to share a bed with Julian Vance. My mind reeled. I tried to focus on the practicalities. I needed to change. I needed to act normal. But what was normal in this situation? I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my chest and quickly swallowed it down. He emerged from the bathroom minutes later, a towel slung around his neck. He was wearing a plain gray t-shirt and a pair of dark sweatpants. His hair was damp, and droplets of water clung to the dark hair on his forearms. The casual intimacy of it was a physical blow. This was a version of him I had never seen, stripped of his tailored suits and his professional armor. He looked younger, more approachable, and infinitely more dangerous to my carefully guarded composure. "Bathroom's yours," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. He went over to the small table and pulled out his laptop, as if he could erect a wall of work between us. I scurried into the bathroom, closing the door with a sense of profound relief. I leaned against it, my eyes closed, and took a deep, shaky breath. The air was steamy and smelled of his soap. It was everywhere. There was no escaping him. I took the fastest shower of my life, the hot water doing little to calm my racing pulse. I changed into my own sleeping clothes, a worn t-shirt and flannel pants that suddenly felt juvenile and ridiculous. When I came out, he was still at the table, his back to me, typing. The only light in the room came from his laptop screen and one dim lamp by the bed, casting long shadows. "I'm, going to turn in," I mumbled, my voice barely a whisper. He grunted in acknowledgement without turning around. I scurried to the bed and slid under the covers on the side farthest from him, pulling the blankets up to my chin like a shield. I lay there, ramrod straight, my eyes wide open in the dim light, listening to the soft click of his keyboard and the howl of the wind outside. The bed was enormous, but I was acutely aware of the vast, empty space beside me, a space he would soon occupy. After what felt like an eternity, the clicking stopped. I heard his chair scrape against the floor. I squeezed my eyes shut, pretending to be asleep. I heard his footsteps, felt the bed dip as he sat on the edge to take off his shoes. My entire body went rigid. Then, the mattress shifted under his weight as he lay down, keeping a careful distance between us. The light clicked off. We were plunged into darkness. The silence was deafening. It was filled with the sound of my own frantic heartbeat and the soft, steady rhythm of his breathing. He was so close. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body across the small gulf of mattress between us. I could smell the clean scent of soap and his skin. It was an agony of proximity. Every nerve in my body was on fire. I lay there for hours, it seemed, listening to him breathe, wondering if he was asleep, wondering what he was thinking. The storm raged outside, a perfect mirror for the tempest inside me. Sometime deep in the night, I must have drifted off into a shallow, restless sleep. I was woken by a sound, a low groan from beside me. My eyes snapped open. Julian was shifting, turning in his sleep. In the faint gray light filtering through a gap in the curtains, I could see his face. His expression was unguarded, his brow furrowed. He seemed to be having a bad dream. He muttered something, a name that was lost in a tangle of blankets and sleep. Then, he shifted again, rolling toward me. His arm came to rest over my waist, his hand settling on my hip. His body was a solid line of heat against my back. I froze. My breath hitched. I lay there, completely still, every muscle tensed. His hand was heavy and warm on my hip, a shocking point of contact that sent a tremor through my entire body. His breathing was deep and even against the back of my neck. He was asleep. He didn't know what he was doing. It was an unconscious act, a simple seeking of warmth and comfort in the night. It should have been nothing. It was everything. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I lay there, a prisoner of his accidental touch, my heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. I was terrified of waking him, of breaking the spell. This was a closeness I had never dared to imagine, and it was excruciatingly, beautifully real. I focused on the weight of his hand, the heat of his body, the sound of his breathing, committing every sensation to memory. In the cold, dark room, with a storm howling outside, I felt a profound and aching sense of connection to the man sleeping beside me. It was a fantasy made real, if only for a few stolen hours. And I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that nothing would ever be the same again. Morning arrived not with a gentle dawn, but with a persistent, gray light that seeped through the cheap motel curtains. I was awake long before the sun, having spent the last few hours in a state of hyper-aware stillness. Julian's arm was still draped over me, a heavy, warm anchor. His breathing was still a soft, steady presence at my back. The intimacy of it was a physical ache in my chest. I knew I had to move, to break the contact before he woke up and the inevitable, crushing awkwardness descended. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I wanted to live in this accidental embrace for just a moment longer. Finally, with a sense of quiet resignation, I carefully, painstakingly, began to extricate myself. I lifted his arm, his muscles lax and heavy with sleep, and gently placed it back on his side of the bed. I slid away, the loss of his warmth immediate and sharp. I sat on the edge of the mattress for a moment, my back to him, gathering myself. My heart was a frantic bird in my chest. I glanced over my shoulder. He was still asleep, his face turned toward the pillow where I had just been. His expression was peaceful, the hard lines of his face softened in slumber. He looked vulnerable, and the sight of it made my throat tighten. I stood and moved silently around the room, gathering my clothes. I dressed in the cramped, steamy bathroom, my reflection in the mirror a stranger with wide, haunted eyes. When I emerged, Julian was stirring. He sat up, running a hand through his already messy hair. He looked around the room, his gaze bleary, until it landed on me. For a split second, there was no filter, no professional mask. There was just confusion, and then a dawning awareness. He looked at the bed, at the space between where he was and where I had been. A faint flush crept up his neck. "Morning," he grumbled, his voice thick with sleep. He cleared his throat and swung his legs out of bed, carefully keeping his eyes averted from mine. "Morning," I replied, my voice a croak. The silence that followed was a living thing. It was thick and heavy with everything that had happened and everything that hadn't been said. We moved around each other in the small space like two opposing magnets, a careful, choreographed dance of avoidance. We got dressed. We packed our bags. We didn't speak. The professional boundary we had relied on was gone, obliterated by the shared intimacy of the night, and we had nothing to replace it with. It was just raw, exposed awkwardness. We checked out of the motel and found the town's only diner. It was a small, cozy place that smelled of coffee and bacon. We slid into a booth, the worn vinyl cool against my legs. A waitress with a tired but friendly face took our order. Coffee, black for him. Coffee with cream and sugar for me. The mundane routine of it was a relief. We sat in silence, stirring our coffees. The clink of my spoon against the ceramic mug sounded deafeningly loud. I stared down at the swirling vortex of brown and white, unable to meet his eyes. I was certain he was regretting this entire trip. He probably thought I was some pathetic, starstruck subordinate. The shame was a hot, bitter taste in my mouth. Then, across the table, he cleared his throat. I forced myself to look up. He was watching me, his expression serious. His gaze was intense, searching. "Leo," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the diner's morning chatter. He paused, as if choosing his next words with immense care. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine where it rested on the cool formica. His touch was deliberate, firm. Not an accident. Not a mistake. His thumb stroked the back of my hand, a small, repetitive motion that sent a shockwave up my arm. "Last night," he said, his eyes holding mine. "In the motel. I'm not sorry it happened." My breath caught. The world seemed to narrow to the space between us, to the warmth of his hand on mine, to the quiet intensity in his hazel eyes. He wasn't talking about his arm around me in the night. He had to be talking about the situation itself, the forced proximity. My mind scrambled for the most professional, least vulnerable interpretation. "It was a logistical issue, Mr. Vance." I started, trying to give him an out, trying to protect myself. "The motel." "Julian," he interrupted, his grip on my hand tightening slightly. "My name is Julian. And I'm not talking about the booking error." He left the sentence hanging in the air, freighted with unspoken meaning. He was giving me a choice. I could retreat back into the safety of our professional roles, or I could meet him here, in this terrifying, uncharted territory. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I looked at his hand on mine. It was large and capable, the hand of a man who built things, who made decisions. It was a hand that was, right now, offering a connection I had only ever dreamed of. I took a shaky breath and turned my hand over, lacing my fingers with his. It was a small, simple gesture, but it felt monumental. It was an answer. A slow, small smile touched his lips. It was the first genuine smile he had ever given me, and it transformed his entire face, erasing the stern lines and revealing a warmth I had never seen. "Good," he said softly. The waitress arrived with our food, and we pulled our hands apart, but the connection lingered. The tension hadn't vanished, but it had changed. It was no longer a wire of anxiety stretched between us. Now, it was a humming current of possibility. We ate in a comfortable silence, the awkwardness replaced by a new, fragile intimacy. We were still boss and employee, still two men on a work trip. But we were also something else now. Something undefined and hopeful. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel so alone. The work on the mountain was a strange paradox. We were there for a job, and we were professionals. We spent hours hiking the rugged terrain, taking measurements, assessing sightlines, and discussing the technical challenges of the build. Julian was in his element, his focus sharp and his knowledge of structural engineering impressive. I found myself matching his energy, my own passion for sustainable design ignited by the raw, untouched beauty of the landscape. We worked well together, our professional minds syncing up in a way that was deeply satisfying. But underneath the surface of our work, the new current between us flowed, strong and undeniable. Every interaction was layered with a second meaning. When he handed me the laser measure, our fingers would brush, and the contact would linger for a fraction of a second too long. When I pointed out a potential site for the geothermal wells, he would stand close behind me, his voice a low murmur near my ear, and the warmth of his body would make my skin tingle. We were in a bubble, a world of just the two of us, surrounded by ancient trees and silent, snow-dusted peaks. The rules of the office, of the city, didn't seem to apply here. The tipping point came on the second day. The weather had turned, the sky a bruised purple that threatened more snow. We were on a high ridge, assessing the wind exposure, when the ground beneath my feet, a patch of loose shale hidden by a thin layer of snow, gave way. I cried out, my arms flailing as I lost my balance, my feet sliding toward the steep, rocky drop-off. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. For a terrifying second, I saw myself tumbling down the mountainside. Then, an arm like a steel band clamped around my chest, yanking me backward with a force that knocked the wind out of me. I stumbled, falling back against a solid wall of muscle. Julian. He had moved with a speed and instinct that was startling. He held me there, his arm locked around me, his other hand gripping my shoulder. I was pressed firmly against his chest, my head tucked under his chin. I could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart against my back, a counterpoint to my own racing pulse. I could smell the cold, clean air on his jacket and the faint, warm scent of his skin. He was breathing hard, his breath ghosting over my hair. Leo, he said, his voice rough with something I couldn't identify. Fear. It was fear. He didn't let go. For a long, breathless moment, he just held me, his grip unyielding. The professional boundary, already so blurred, was completely annihilated. This wasn't my boss holding an employee. This was a man holding on to another man he had been terrified of losing. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Finally, his grip loosened slightly. Are you all right? He asked, his voice still ragged. I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. I was trembling, a combination of adrenaline and the overwhelming proximity of him. He slowly, reluctantly, let me go, but his hand stayed on my shoulders, steadying me. He looked down at me, his hazel eyes dark with a fierce, raw emotion. The carefully constructed walls of Julian Vance, the stoic principal architect, were gone. In their place was just Julian, and he looked terrified. We need to be more careful, he said, his voice low and intense. I knew he wasn't just talking about the treacherous terrain. He was talking about us, about this fragile, dangerous thing that was building between us. The air was charged, thick with unspoken words. The wind whipped around us, pulling at our clothes, but I felt rooted to the spot, held by the weight of his gaze. I saw it then, in the depths of his eyes. The same yearning, the same fear, the same desperate hope that I had been hiding for so long. It was there, reflected back at me. We stood there on that windy ridge for what felt like an eternity, the world falling away until it was just the two of us. The subtext of the last 2 days had finally risen to the surface, a tangible force between us. There was no going back. We both knew it. The only question was what would happen next. That evening, back in the small, claustrophobic motel room, the air was different. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. The near accident on the mountain had stripped away our last defenses. We couldn't pretend this was just a work trip anymore. We couldn't pretend the single bed was just a logistical inconvenience. It was now a stage, and we were the only two actors, the script unwritten. We didn't turn on the television. We didn't open our laptops. We just existed in the space, orbiting each other. I sat on the edge of one of the chairs, and he stood by the window, looking out at the darkness. The silence stretched, pulled taut between us. I watched his reflection in the dark glass, the set of his shoulders, the way his hands were shoved into the pockets of his jeans. You looked scared today, I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. My voice was quiet, but in the stillness of the room, it sounded like a shout. He turned from the window to face me. His expression was shadowed, his eyes impossible to read in the dim light. He said, his voice flat. He took a step toward me. When you slipped. For a second, I couldn't, he trailed off, shaking his head slightly, as if the words were impossible to find. He didn't have to finish. I understood. He took another step, closing the distance until he was standing directly in front of me. I had to crane my neck to look up at him. He was so tall, so solid. His presence was all-consuming. He reached out, his hand coming to rest on the side of my neck, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin just below my ear. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent a fire racing through my veins. "Leo," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. And that was it. That was the breaking point. All the years of silent pining, all the pent-up tension of the last 48 hours, all the fear and hope and uncertainty coalesced into a single, overwhelming need. I surged up from the chair, my hands going to his waist to steady myself, and met him halfway. His mouth came down on mine. The first kiss wasn't gentle. It was desperate, hungry, a collision of two people who had been starving for something they didn't know how to ask for. It was a release of pressure, a confession made without words. His lips were firm, insistent, and I responded with an eagerness that surprised me. I threaded my fingers into his hair, pulling him closer, and he made a low sound in the back of his throat, his arm wrapping around my waist, lifting me against him. Then, as quickly as it started, the desperation softened. The kiss gentled, deepened. It became something else. It was no longer a frantic release, but a slow, deliberate exploration. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was honest. It was right. It felt like coming home to a place I had never been before. He pulled back slightly, just enough so our lips were barely brushing. He rested his forehead against mine. We were both breathing heavily, our chests rising and falling in unison. His eyes were closed, his long lashes dark against his skin. "Leo," he breathed my name again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. It was an acknowledgement. It was everything. He opened his eyes, and his gaze was clear. The storm of emotion settled into a calm, steady certainty. He reached down and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, his grip firm and sure. In the quiet of that cheap motel room, with the wind still whispering outside, a new silence fell between us. But this one wasn't empty. It was full. It was full of a shared understanding, a silent promise, and the beginning of something I had long ago given up on ever finding. I woke slowly, drifting up from the deepest, most peaceful sleep I'd had in years. The first thing I registered was warmth. A profound, bone-deep warmth that enveloped me completely. The second was a weight, a solid presence at my back. I opened my eyes. The room was still dark, the pre-dawn light a faint gray wash against the curtains. I was curled on my side, and Julian was spooned behind me, his arm thrown possessively over my waist, his hand resting on my stomach. His legs were tangled with mine, and his chest was a solid wall of heat against my back. His breathing was a slow, even rhythm against my neck. For a perfect, crystalline moment, there was no anxiety, no fear of the future. There was only this, the simple, profound reality of being held. The feeling of safety, of being wanted, was so overwhelming it made my throat ache. I lay there, hardly daring to breathe, trying to memorize the feeling of his body against mine, the weight of his hand, the scent of his skin. This was real. Last night was real. But as the room slowly brightened, the real world began to intrude. The questions started to whisper at the edges of my mind. What now? What did this mean? He was my boss. I was his employee. Was this a one-time aberration, a product of forced proximity and a near-death experience on a mountain? The fear of regret, his regret, began to bloom in my chest, a cold, thorny vine. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't face him when he woke up, not with this roiling uncertainty inside me. I needed space. I needed to put some distance between us, to reassemble the armor I had so completely shed last night. With the same painstaking care as the morning before, I began to ease myself away from him. His grip on me tightened in his sleep, a low murmur escaping his lips. My heart clenched. I gently lifted his hand from my stomach and slid out of the bed, the cold air of the room a shock against my skin. I dressed quickly and quietly in the dark, grabbing my bag. I didn't know where I was going. For a walk. To the diner for coffee. Anywhere but here. I scribbled a hasty note on the motel notepad, went for coffee, and left it on the table. As I reached for the doorknob, I risked one last look back at the bed. He had rolled into the space I had just vacated, his arm flung out over my empty pillow. The sight was so unexpectedly tender, so poignant, that it almost made me stay. But the fear was stronger. I slipped out of the room. the click of the closing door sounding like a final, painful punctuation mark. The diner was mostly empty at this hour, just a few truckers hunched over their coffees. I took the same booth as yesterday, a lonely occupant in a space that had felt so full of possibility just 24 hours before. The friendly waitress brought me coffee, and I wrapped my cold hands around the warm mug, staring out the window at the quiet, snowy street. I felt hollowed out. The joy and relief of last night had been replaced by a gnawing anxiety. I had let myself be vulnerable, and now I was terrified of the consequences. What if I had misread everything? What if he woke up and realized he'd made a terrible mistake? I would have to see him every day at work, the memory of last night a constant, humiliating ghost between us. I had potentially ruined my career and my heart in one fell swoop. I was on my second cup of coffee when the bell over the diner door jingled. I didn't look up, consumed by my own miserable thoughts. Then, a shadow fell over my table. I glanced up, and my heart stopped. It was Julian. He was fully dressed, his jacket zipped up, his hair still slightly damp from a shower. His face was unreadable, his jaw tight. He stood there for a long moment, just looking down at me. The silence stretched, and every terrible scenario I had imagined played out in my head. He was here to tell me it was a mistake. He was here to tell me to forget it ever happened. He slid into the booth opposite me, his movements stiff. He didn't order anything. He just sat there, his hands resting on the table, his gaze fixed on my face. "You left," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, but it was weighted with something else. Hurt. I needed some air. I stammered, my eyes dropping to my coffee cup. "I didn't want to wake you." Leo, his voice was soft, but it commanded my attention. I forced myself to meet his eyes. The intensity one saw there made my breath catch. "Look at me." I did. I looked at him, my chest tight with dread. "I woke up," he said slowly, deliberately, "and you were gone. And for a minute, I thought I had dreamed it. I thought maybe I had crossed a line and you ran." He paused, and I saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a crack in his stoic facade that mirrored my own. Did I cross a line? The question was so direct, so honest, it disarmed me completely. All my carefully constructed fears seemed to crumble in the face of his raw sincerity. He wasn't here to reject me. He was here because he was just as scared as I was. "No," I whispered, the word thick with emotion. "No, Julian, you didn't." Relief washed over his face, a visible loosening of the tension in his shoulders. He reached across the table, just as he had done yesterday. But this time, he didn't just cover my hand. He took it, his fingers wrapping around mine, a firm, grounding presence. "Waking up this morning," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble. "Before I realized you were gone. Waking up with you there. It felt right. It felt like the most right thing that's happened to me in a very long time." He squeezed my hand. "Last night was not a mistake, Leo. Not for me. Was it a mistake for you?" I looked at him, at the earnest, hopeful question in his eyes. The last vestiges of my fear dissolved, replaced by a surge of warmth, of certainty. I shook my head, a slow, definite movement. "No," I said, my voice clearer now, stronger. "It wasn't a mistake." A slow smile spread across his face, the same genuine, unguarded smile from yesterday. It lit up his eyes. "Good," he said again, the word filled with a world of meaning. "Now, are you going to finish that coffee, or can we get back on the road? We have a project to finish." The drive back to the city was the complete opposite of the drive up. The silence was no longer a void of tension and uncertainty. It was a comfortable, shared space. We didn't talk much, but we didn't need to. Every so often, he would reach over and rest his hand on my knee, a simple, proprietary gesture that sent a thrill through me every time. I would look over at him, at his strong profile against the blur of the passing landscape, and I would have to suppress a smile. It all felt so fragile, so new, but so incredibly real. As we neared the city limits, the familiar skyline appearing on the horizon, a familiar anxiety began to creep back in. The bubble was about to burst. We were about to return to the real world, to the office, to Mr. Vance and Leo. The power dynamic, the professional rules, they were all waiting for us. How could this new, fragile thing between us possibly survive that? As if sensing my shift in mood, Julian took the next exit, pulling the truck into a scenic overlook that offered a panoramic view of the city below. He cut the engine, and the cab was filled with the quiet hum of the late afternoon. He turned in his seat to face me, his expression serious. "We're almost back," he said. "I know," I replied, my voice small. "This doesn't end here, Leo," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. His gaze was steady, unwavering. "What happened on this trip? It wasn't just about being stuck in a motel room. For me, this has been building for a long time. I didn't know how to act on it. Or if I even could." My eyes widened. "A long time." He gave a small, self-deprecating huff of a laugh. "Longer than you think. I've been watching you, too." He reached out, his fingers gently tracing my jawline. "I saw the way your mind works in your designs. I saw the passion you have for your work. I saw the quiet kindness in you. I just didn't know if you could ever see me as anything other than your boss." I was floored. All this time, while I had been secretly observing him from my corner of the office, he had been watching me right back. The thought was staggering, world-altering. "I always saw him more than my boss," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. His smile was soft, full of a deep, abiding warmth. "I know things will be complicated at work. We'll have to be discreet. But I don't want to hide this. I don't want to pretend this didn't happen. I want more of this. With you." He took a deep breath, his expression turning determined. "I have a cabin. Up in the mountains, a couple of hours from here. It's quiet. Private. Come with me this weekend. Not as my employee. Not for a work trip. Just come with me. As Leo." It was a conscious choice. An offer of a future, of a space where we could be just us, away from the world that knew us as Mr. Vance and his subordinate. It was everything I wanted and everything I was terrified of. But looking into his steady, hopeful eyes, I knew there was only one answer I could possibly give. "Okay," I said, a real, genuine smile breaking across my face. "Yes, I'd like that." The following Saturday, I found myself driving up a winding mountain road, the directions Julian had given me clutched in my hand. The anxiety was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by a heady sense of anticipation. I pulled up to a small, secluded cabin nestled amongst a stand of tall pine trees. It was beautiful, all warm wood and wide windows, with a curl of smoke rising from a stone chimney. It looked like something I would have designed myself. Julian was waiting for me on the porch. He wasn't wearing a suit or even the rugged gear from our work trip. He was in a soft, worn flannel shirt and jeans, a mug of coffee in his hand. He looked relaxed, happy. He looked like home. He smiled as I got out of the car, a wide, easy smile that reached his eyes. "You made it," he said. "I made it," I confirmed, my own smile feeling just as wide. The weekend passed in a dream of quiet intimacy. We cooked together in his small, functional kitchen, our bodies brushing past each other in a comfortable, easy dance. We talked for hours, really talked, sharing stories from our pasts, our hopes for the future. We sat by the fire, the warmth on our faces, his arm around my shoulders, my head resting against his chest. We slept in his large, comfortable bed, not as a matter of necessity, but as a matter of choice. And waking up in his arms, with the morning sun streaming through the window and the smell of coffee brewing, felt like the most natural thing in the world. On Sunday morning, I was standing at the large window in the living room, looking out at the sun-dappled forest, a mug of coffee warming my hands. Julian came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and pulling me back against his chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder, his embrace warm and secure. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble against my ear. I leaned back into him, a sense of peace settling over me that was so profound it was almost overwhelming. I thought about the man I had been just a week ago, lonely, invisible, trapped in a cycle of quiet observation and silent yearning. I thought about the fear, the uncertainty, the overwhelming feeling that my life was happening somewhere else, to someone else. And then I thought about now, about the solid warmth of the man holding me, about the shared laughter and the quiet conversations, about the feeling of his hand in mine, a perfect, anchoring fit. The journey had been terrifying, a free fall from a cliff of my own making, but he had been there to catch me. Or, more accurately, we had caught each other. "I'm thinking," I said softly, turning my head to press a soft kiss to his cheek. that I'm finally exactly where I'm supposed to be. I was no longer just an observer. I was here. I was seen. I was home.